Hello and welcome to Screenalysis, the show in which we analyse the silver screen. Please be aware there are going to be big spoilers as we talk about these movies. Anyway, my name is Daniel and I'm here with my friend Carl.
Hello!
And what movies have we chosen to talk about today?
Oh, we've got some gems. We have the 1977 classic Annie Hall by Woody Allen.
And I'm going to talk about Eternal Sunshine, written by Charlie Kaufman, directed by Michel Gondry, and released in 2004.
Okay.
So, we are not looking at rom-coms, as you might have noticed by our choice of movie. We are looking at more alternative rom-coms. We are looking at two movies that twist the genres, twist the tropes in interesting ways, we both feel.
Maybe we should talk about what is a rom-com before we decide what breaks a rom-com. So what is a rom-com?
Basically, a romantic comedy is a comedy in which two people come together in some way, shape or form. Usually these two people are pretty unlikely for each other. If you look at You've Got Mail. For example, the story there is of Meg Ryan. She owns a small bookstore, and Tom Hanks, who's major corporation in terms of bookstores, practically moves in next door, threatens to destroy her business. But as the movie progresses, they realise that they love each other and can't be without each other. That's just one example of a rom-com. But yeah, unlikely duos who manage to find some positive attributes within each other, and those attributes match what each other needs, and so they come together at the end of the movie.
There are hundreds of these movies.
There certainly are, and to look at every single one of them and really truly try and define what a rom-com is, good luck doing that. I'm sure someone's written a book somewhere, but yeah.
Consider it an exercise for the listener. Good luck. Have fun. Let us know how that goes.
Do you have any thoughts about what a rom-com is?
No, that pretty much sums up my thoughts. I think we've all seen a bunch of these. There are a few notable ones. When Harry Met Sally stands out as a rather good one. But honestly, most of the rom-coms I've seen, I've actually forgotten. I've forgotten who was seeing who and who directed what. They all just sort of blend into one kind of gummy lump of a movie.
Well, I mean, when Harry Met Sally, that's a good example of a movie that doesn't really truly fit into the definition that I've just put forward.
No, it is almost an alternative rom-com. Not quite, though. It more or less wraps up the way it sets out to, but with a few twists.
Okay, well, I'm sure we will be examining some of the tropes of more traditional rom-coms as we explore our two chosen movies. But shall we get into our first movie? So let's begin with Annie Hall.
Okay, Annie Hall by Woody Allen, directed and written by Woody Allen. This sets out looking a lot like a traditional romantic comedy. The summary of this is pretty basic. Woody Allen, as his character Alvy Singer, meets Diane Keaton's character Annie Hall. They hit it off, they fall in love, they break up, they get back together, they break up. What a movie! That's a good one. And that's pretty much what happens in the movie. Am I missing anything?
From a plot point of view, a plot summary point of view, not too much.
No. There's a lot of details that go on here. I don't want to sell this movie short. It actually is really good. This movie was considered revolutionary at the time, and it still holds up. It's very funny. The humor comes from the fact that Woody Allen is aware that this is a movie, and he is constantly breaking the fourth wall and joking with the audience, turning to other characters and breaking the scene so that he can carry on a conversation with them and they can comment about his relationship. It's the idea that he's this dysfunctional character that cannot make this straightforward romantic comedy work?
Well, let's look at the dysfunctional character aspect a
Okay.
lot more. Now, a lot of this is from Woody Allen, or rather Alvy Singer's point of view. And we explore his relationship with Annie Hall in the larger context of his whole life. So there's a lot of flashbacks to his childhood, for example. But not just flashbacks, there's a lot of surrealism going on throughout the story. External characters are able to intrude upon Woody Allen's memories and even influence his memories to some degree. There's a lot of surrealism going on. I mean, one memory is portrayed as an animation.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of juxtaposition where, as the audience, we kind of have to fill in the gaps where some major event has happened. And we kind of like have to run up to speed to work out where Alvy is in terms of his story and what has preceded that has not been shown. There's all sorts of interesting techniques.
Mm-hmm.
But all of this leads to a rather interesting and, as you put it, dysfunctional narrator. And it's the dysfunctional thing that interests me. Because through the use of surrealism, through the use of not entirely trustworthy memories, how much are we able to trust Alvy Singer as a narrator of his own story?
And obviously, we can't trust him at all.
Well, there's a device right at the very end of the movie. He is writing a theatre play about his and Annie Hall's relationship, in which he shows us that he is twisting some of the details to make himself look a bit more favourable. He shows us this device, and by continually breaking the fourth wall and acknowledging us as an audience, how much can we trust that he isn't, again, manipulating the story to get us, the audience, on his side?
Certainly is. And there's lots of examples. There's lots of examples of him doing this. Standing in line at the movies. This is one of the famous scenes from this. And he's being annoyed by the person behind him and having a conversation with Annie Hall standing beside him. And he starts breaking the fourth wall and commenting at the audience, finally getting into an argument with the person behind him, who starts quoting Marshall McLuhan. He says, "You know what? I happen to have Marshall McLuhan right here," drags Marshall McLuhan, the communications theorist, onto the screen, and just lets Marshall McLuhan break this guy's argument down and discard him. So, yeah, this is very surreal. This is, anything happens in the story that Alvy Singer wants to happen in the story, because you're not watching the story unfold the way you do in most romantic comedies. You're listening to Alvy Singer tell you the story that happened. And when you tell stories, events get put out of order. We stop and go back and reflect upon his youth. We jump backwards to when they met, or when they went to a particular party, as it becomes relevant to the story, or he just changes events because it makes for a better joke.
And joke is a key word there, because his profession is a stand-up comedian. And let's face it, a lot of stand-up comedians do manipulate events in order to find the funny in a story. What's the classic adage? It's tragedy plus time equals comedy. But as a comedian, he's used to speaking to audiences, telling stories in the way that he knows work best, that are not necessarily true. And as a professional comedian, a lot of the same techniques are coming out through his storytelling, through his narration. So I'm getting Woody Allen, the person, and Alvy, the character, a bit mixed up. Alvy, the narrator, is using similar tropes as a comedian, similar techniques as a comedian in the narration of his story, in the directing of his theatre play.
I think it's a fair confusion. I mean, Woody Allen was a very popular stand-up comedian at this point. His character is a very popular stand-up comedian in the story. He starts, the very first scene is him standing there as a stand-up comic delivering lines. And honestly, of all his movies, I would say this one probably is closest to his stand-up routine. This is a dramatization of his shtick. As opposed to a lot of his movies where there's usually a story or there's skits that get played out. But this is, I think, as close to his routine as you're ever going to see in a film.
Well, let's go back. Let's look at some of the scenes that display this type of thing. Let's have a look at the animated scene.
Sure, I think that's a favorite of yours.
Well, it's an interesting one. Because basically what happens, spoiler alert, they have a big argument. Then we see the animated scene in which Annie Hall is transformed into basically the evil witch from
Snow White.
Snow White, thank you. And then the next scene, he's dating someone else. So we are aware that they've effectively broken up. We have to work it out. The breakup is not immediately or directly addressed. Again, an example of juxtaposition that I was talking about. We go from an animated scene, crash into Alvy starting a new relationship with very little in between. And so what I find interesting about this is that basically this is not a memory that can be trusted at all. There are two ways that we can potentially look at this. In that, through this memory, through this thought or dream or whatever it's supposed to be, because it breaks the reality, because it breaks the world so much, it suggests that Alvy has no control. That he is effectively not a participant in his own life, that events have just snowballed and he's been pushed away. And so his mind is struggling to work out what has happened. Another way that you can look at this is that the breakup is such a traumatic event that he has regressed. The only way for him to be able to deal with this breakup is for him to look at Annie Hall through the eyes of a child. That she is the evil witch, and that's the only way that his brain can process what is going on.
Yeah, I think that's certainly there. I think it's important to remember too that as a narrative, this is being told, purposefully being told to us by a stand-up comedian. So, like in most stand-up comics, you shouldn't take a punchline too seriously. So he sets up the idea that, when he watched Snow White, he fell in love with the evil queen. Well, that's the setup.
This is Woody Allen or Alvy Singer? This is
Alvy Singer,
right.
Moments before we skip into this animated scene. So the very next scene, he's talking to the animated queen. So this was a setup, and here's the punchline. Here's the payoff. And that payoff leads into the next joke. The way a stand-up comedian will get an audience laughing at something and then lead that into the next joke. I don't want to take away that there's relevance to this as a character, but remember that there are two Alvy Singers in this movie. There's the Alvy Singer as a character that we see interacting with Annie Hall and hanging out in New York and playing tennis. And there is an Alvy Singer that is standing there at the beginning and the ends of the movies delivering a stand-up routine and telling us this story as the narrator. And it's the L.V. Singer as a narrator that has control over how this story is being told. L.V. Singer inside the story is really no different than Annie Hall or his actor friend or any other character in this story.
Well, arguably there's a third L.V. Singer, the child L.V. Singer. And as I mentioned before, he is trying to contextualize his relationship with Annie Hall through examining the entirety of his life. So what purpose do you feel the flashbacks to his early childhood, what purpose do they have? Are they entirely necessary to the story, do you feel?
I think they're necessary to developing the character and the themes of the story. And again, a lot of this is a setup to a joke. In the very first opening monologue, he starts talking about Freud. So right away, that should be a key. And then in all of these flashbacks early on, you see symbols of emasculation and, there's his mother sitting there yelling at him, peeling a carrot, vigorously peeling a carrot with vigorously peeling a carrot. There we go.
Because to me, these flashback scenes, they're less about exposition and more an attempt for L.V. Singer to justify himself, why he is such a neurotic character. And how these experiences created the L.V. Singer that we see in 1970s New York. Because let's face it, coming back to romantic comedies, L.V. Singer doesn't really stand up as a more traditional romantic comedy male lead.
No, he's deliberately portrayed as being neurotic and self-defeating and self-centered, selfish, and completely incapable of learning a lesson. Repeatedly incapable of growing as a human being.
Because here's my thought. That very often in romantic comedies, one of the ways in which the two leads are able to understand each other is effectively by baring their souls to each other. In many movies, there's maybe a scene where, it's a way for them to understand each other, see, he's not just a horrible person, he does actually have this lovable side. Whereas in Annie Hall, L.V. Singer very rarely opens himself up to Annie Hall. He opens himself up to us, the audience, and that's an interesting thought. It's more like he's having a relationship with us than he is with Annie Hall in so many ways.
Well, remember, again, which L.V. Singer is opening up to us. It's the narrator who's opening up to us and telling us all this stuff. The L.V. Singer who's actually in the relationship with Annie Hall, he's just a pawn in this story. He's not opening up to us anything, right? He's just a tool of the narration. So again, it's this narrator setting up a joke and letting it pay off, setting up the next story and letting it pay off. So the narrator is opening up to us, but how much the narrator is similar to the L.V. Singer in the story, that's kind of up for grabs. That's kind of a guess. I couldn't tell you how much these two characters have in common.
It's like he's often wearing a mask. And I'd like to explore that idea a little bit. Coming back to a traditional romantic comedy, as I say, there are very often negative attributes that both characters have. But as the movie progresses, they are able to show more of their positive sides their positive sides start to outweigh their negative sides. Kind of as if they are, by displaying their positive sides, they are putting on a mask. This is how I want to be seen. These are the things that I don't want to be seen anymore. So the negative sides are hidden, but not necessarily gone. They've put on a mask. Whereas in Annie Hall, during their relationship, we see basically their negative aspects. We see Annie Hall as a big pot smoker, which obviously affects Alvy Singer because she can only effectively have sex with him if she's high. And Woody Allen is a death-obsessed neurotic. However, when we first see them, they are both stumbling fools. Annie Hall particularly is extremely nervous. Alvy Singer is a little bit more confident, but really, again, you can see that he's nervous, unsure of himself. Basically, in that first meeting, it's kind of like they are weak and exposed. And they are deliberately masking what they're saying. There's that scene where what they are saying to each other and what their true intentions are is subtitled. So, for example, it looks like they're having small, nice little chit-chat, but really it's, I want to go out with you, I want to get you in bed, you seem like a nice person. These are the thoughts that they are unable to portray. So, to a degree, they are exposing themselves, but they want to hold back. I have an interesting take during the relationship. They are not afraid to show their much less desirable traits. And I'm wondering if these less desirable traits are actually the mask, that they are exaggerating. Alvy Singer is exaggerating his neurosis. Annie Hall is exaggerating her pot-smoking nature. Because these are things that they can control more. And these are masks that they can wear to stop their weaker aspects being exposed, their more nervous, unsure natures from being exposed. I mean, that's a theory. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think that might be part of it. A lot of the humor in this movie, particularly towards the end, is Alvy Singer's inability to grow and actually fall in love. The rom-com model says that at a certain point, the characters will come into conflict and break up, but then they will each grow as people and discover the beauty in each other and then be able to come back together and live happily ever after. Once we reach that point in this movie, Annie Hall grows. Her character, she develops as a professional singer. She develops intellectually. She's going to college.
She develops with her confidence as well.
She's very much a developed new character, whereas Woody Allen's character, Alvy Singer, is exactly the same neurotic mess that he was at the beginning. He's failed to learn any lesson. He's failed to grow. He's failed to open up to her. And I think we're seeing that in the characters' masks, in the way they hold this back and cover up. She comes out of the mask. He never does.
So then, who should we sympathise more? Which character should we sympathise more with? Or which character's side should we be on? Should we be on the side of Annie Hall? Should we be on the side of Alvy Singer? Should we be on both of their sides? Or neither of their sides?
If this were a traditional rom-com, I would say Annie Hall. But the whole point of this movie is that it's not a traditional rom-com. And the nature of the narration and the way the story is being told, it's really impossible to side with any character except Alvy Singer, except Woody Allen's character. You're just not privy to enough of the inner dialogue, to the emotional state of any other character than him. And that's okay, because again, you're not really supposed to have a strong emotional connection to anyone. This is an intellectual comedy. It's meant to be a thinky sort of experience, not a feely sort of experience. So I don't think it's really a detraction that you don't identify strongly with any other character.
It's interesting you say that, because obviously Annie Hall is a pot smoker. You're saying that this is a thinky sort of experience where, let's face it, as much as people want to talk about the universe and everything when they're high, I mean, it's a drug. Ultimately, it does inhibit.
Yeah, but she's movie high. Like, she's still carrying on conversations. She doesn't actually get affected by this in the narrative. The only effect that we see in the narrative is how irritated Alvy Singer becomes because he wants her not stoned. That's the only effect that this has. Her performance doesn't change. She just smokes pot, and then Alvy Singer complains about her smoking pot because he wants to have sex with her. That's it.
Okay, well, as you mentioned earlier, we only ever see Annie Hall through the eyes of Woody Allen. We never get to see Annie Hall tell her side of the story in any way, shape or form. As you mentioned, Alvy Singer fails to grow as a person, whereas she does. And you also suggested that in a lot of rom-coms, you know, they learn to find each other and appreciate each other, grow to love each other, or understand more about each other. And I kind of feel that Alvy Singer overcomes a lot of his conflict with her and is able to appreciate her for what she is.
Is he though? Because when do you see him grow or learn to appreciate her?
Well, let's look at the Pam, the Rolling Stone writer that he dates after they break up. Is she just not a substitute for Annie Hall?
Yeah.
I mean,
much.
Alvy Singer has been married twice prior to him dating Annie Hall. And we get to see slices of his life with those wives. But Annie Hall is very distinct. So the fourth girlfriend, or the fourth partner of his that we see, is effectively, he is trying to recreate his relationship with Annie Hall. The famous lobster scene. The famous lobster scene where they're running around trying to catch lobsters. That is repeated when he's dating Pam, but this time Pam's just like, no, you do it. I can't be bothered to chase around. So he's wanting to recreate his relationship with Annie Hall. But obviously Pam is not Annie Hall.
Yeah, no, it's, the replacements he finds for her are never adequate, but he never changes in any way to grow into this relationship. Even to the end where ultimately he just writes a play so that the Annie Hall character that he can invent and manipulate is the one who stands up and says, okay, well, I'll go back to New York with you. Because the real Annie Hall wouldn't, because he wouldn't change, he wouldn't evolve, he wouldn't do something new or different to keep up with her evolution as a character. He starts to miss her, even flying across the country to try and bring her back to New York. But when he gets there, he's exactly the same Alvy Singer that he was a month ago, a year ago. He doesn't change. He doesn't learn that lesson.
But do you feel like a lot of his identity is intertwined with Annie Hall? To give you an example, his name is Alvy Singer. Her profession is a singer. To me, this suggests that she is a part of him. She's obviously her own individual self. But the person that he believes she is a part of himself. That he needs her, much like in a traditional rom-com, to complete him in many ways.
Yeah, but that never comes together. It never happens.
It doesn't come together, but
And it's his fault. It's clearly and repeatedly his fault because, again, he doesn't grow, he doesn't change, he always falls back to his neuroses, he always falls back to just not changing or evolving, even to the point where, he starts saying, oh, geez, I miss flirting, I miss being single, I miss doing all these things, even though immediately after they break up, he regrets breaking up.
But then he projects a lot of himself onto her. For example, it is shown that Annie Hall is a terrible driver. She's just swerving all over the place, almost getting into accidents, etc. But as the film goes on, and we get to see Alvy Singer behind the car, we realise that he is a much worse driver than she is. So
what are you saying? That we can't rely on our narrator?
We cannot rely on our narrator, that he is... Okay, maybe it's the opposite way. Maybe he feels, Alvy Singer feels, that Annie Hall cannot be complete without him. And if they cannot be together physically or emotionally, through the narration of the movie, he can at least project aspects of himself, again, some of the more negative aspects, onto her to make her seem more complete. We're going a lot more unconscious and a lot more reading between the lines here. This is my own personal interpretation. But then, maybe by projecting himself onto her, he feels that he is completing her.
I agree. I agree with you. I think that's what we're seeing. And I think that's why this is a thinky comedy as opposed to a feely romance like we had been seeing in romantic comedies for the decade prior to this.
Okay.
So, I don't want to get too far into how this fits into the larger picture of film until we've talked about Eternal Sunshine. So is there anything else you want to say about Annie Hall?
Off the top of my head, I can't think of anything right now. I'm sure things will come later on. So I guess you want to move on to Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind?
Sure, why don't you tell us about Eternal Sunshine?
I'll give it a go. I knew I should have written up a plot summary in advance. I might have to take one or two goes at this.
Yeah, this is Inglourious Bastards all over again.
So, Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, written by Charlie Kaufman, directed by Michel Gondry. Forgive me if I flounder around the plot a little bit, but I'm going to try and summarise it as best and concisely as I can. Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind is basically about a couple that has broken up, and rather than move on, this is a world in which memory deletion is possible. Rather than move on, they just decide to get rid of each other from their lives by completely wiping their memories of each other. Now, we see this through the perspective of the male protagonist, Joel, played by Jim Carrey. And as his memories are being deleted, we get to see the relationship being told. The memory deletion begins with much more recent memories and moves backwards. So effectively we are seeing a relationship in reverse. So we get to see them arguing in the latter stages of their relationship, and as the film progresses, we get to see Joel's happier memories of their earlier stages of their relationship. As we regress through his memories and the happier memories come, he wants to preserve his memories, and his unconscious self starts to fight against the erasure of his memory, and he searches for ways to hide the memory of his ex-girlfriend Clementine in his head. So there we go. It's basically a love story in reverse.
Okay, I'm impressed. Yeah. I didn't think you were going to be able to do that one so concisely. Good work.
Thank you. There's a lot more to this movie.
There's a lot more to this movie that we didn't mention.
I mean, this is a movie that operates in 3 distinct time zones. This is a flashback narrative that has a flashback narrative built into it. So the 3 time zones are the day after the memory is erased, where Joel wakes up in this world and has no idea of some preceding events. For example, his car's scratched. He assumes it's the car driver next to him and writes a note. Anyway, he decides to go to Montauk?
Montauk.
Okay, thank you. He randomly decides to go to the seaside town in the middle of winter, skipping off work, in which he meets Kate Winslet, Clementine, and they start building up a relationship. We then flashback to the events that led to Joel deciding to erase his memory. He has gone to visit Clementine where she works at a bookstore. She is kissing someone else. He doesn't understand what's going on. He thinks they're still together. She doesn't recognize him. So these events lead up to him getting his memory erased. And then the third flashback time era is the memories of the relationship.
Yeah, Charlie Kaufman, he likes to write those straightforward scripts, doesn't he?
You can't get more straightforward than Synecdoche, New York, I'll tell you that.
No, that's I think a good summary of Eternal Sunshine of a Spotless Mind. Wow. So this is a favorite movie of mine. I love this movie.
Depending on when you ask me, it's somewhere between the top 10 to favourite movie of all time.
So, high praise. This movie comes with high praise. I love the different layers. It's one of those movies you can go back to time and time again. And it's not even that you find new details. It's just that you learn to look at the whole thing in a different light, in a different angle, as you find yourself in different areas and different places in your life. Which I think is a great definition of a good work of art, is something that you can read into differently depending on where you're sitting. Would you like to talk about how this relates to the romantic comedy?
Well, we get to see a relationship. We get to see 2 people come together. And that basically is what happens. We get, kind of like Annie Hall, we get to see them start dating twice. And we do see the conflicts. And we do see the positive sides of each other. In many ways, and it's interesting how it's portrayed, because the earlier memories where they are happier, and the latter memories where they are at conflict, the way they are placed within the film structure, not chronological structure, the film structure, if anything, kind of reflects the Hollywood model. So just like the Hollywood model, the traditional model, we see these 2 people at conflict as we go through the process of watching the movie. We see them opening up their more positive sides. We see them happy and being together.
Remember, it's not just us who sees it this way, because Joel, as he's having his memories erased, he loses those last memories as he goes. When he's halfway through this memory, he doesn't remember how terrible it was with Clementine in those last days of the relationship.
Exactly.
So you watch him fall in love with her all over again.
Exactly. Of course, the events, chronologically, are completely reversed. But this is a movie, much like Annie Hall, that is very much influenced by the narrator's point of view. Unlike Annie Hall, however, we are allowed to see Clementine away from the influence of Joel. There is a storyline going on as Joel's memories are being wiped. We do get to see Clementine operating in her own mini story, but at least away from the influence of Joel's point of view. We get to see her as she is. We don't get to see much, therefore we cannot confirm if Joel's view of her is tainted or not, and therefore his presentation of her is tainted or not. But we are at least allowed a glimpse into an external Clementine. But as you mentioned, the latter memories, the unhappy memories, are erased. And therefore, you take away that pain, he's left with only happiness. His memories are influenced. There is another external factor that influences him. It turns out that Clementine is dating one of the team that is erasing his memory. And Joel, even though he's unconscious, he's taken pills, he's laying in bed, unable to do anything, he is aware enough of the external world to pick up that one of his guys is dating someone. This person has to be Clementine. So not only is Clementine being taken away from his mind, Clementine is being taken away from him physically, which means that he becomes very protective of her, really needs to find a way to keep her for himself, both in mind, if not, rather in mind, if not in body. Which comes back to the point that, this is his point of view. How trustworthy is Joel as a narrator? He is being, although we see his early memories where they're coming together, having good times, some of the external present world is influencing his point of view. Mm-hmm. Maybe giving him rose-tinted glasses.
Yeah, and not only that, but again, because he keeps forgetting the worst parts. So as we go on, he's getting more and more in love with Clementine. And also, too, whenever we're looking into his memories, which is the bulk of the movie, we're really seeing things from his point of view. We're privy to his inner monologue. He gets to act out in these memories in ways that he didn't necessarily the first time through. So the Joel we see in those memories is really different than the Joel we see interacting outside of the memories when he's awake. Because he's this very withdrawn,
he's very
nervous
passive
character, very passive, mopey, timid. Mm-hmm. He's very timid. Whereas in his memories, he's not. He's not afraid to jump in his car and chase after his girlfriend. He's not afraid to grab her and run off trying to protect her. So this is...
and we see him fighting the external world as well.
Yeah.
He comes into conflict with the team, wiping his memory. He... by hiding his memories or by jumping into memories that were not mapped in terms of raising Clementine, it causes challenges for the team wiping his memory to find him. So, he fights back. He fights back in a big way, not just within his own psyche, but with the external world, with the antagonists who are taking Clementine away from him. So we were talking about Joel as an unreliable narrator. Now, another factor here is a lot of his memories, we see them as they are being deleted. So the world around him is often crumbling away. Joel does not have a good view of the world. It is very distorted. And this is a visual memory. This is a visual metaphor of the clarity of the perspective that Joel has. His perspective is being eroded away. If Joel is not able to see the world around him clearly. Therefore, then how can we trust what he's saying? There might be details that would explain more that have got erased somewhere. For example, the scene where he's chasing after Clementine. And how to describe this, it's kind of like, what's his name? It's kind of like an M.C. Escher painting, in that as he gets to one end of the road, there's his car. So he turns around, following Clementine, who's walking the opposite direction. He gets to the end of the road, there's his car. It's like this street is completely mirrored on either side. He's unable to comprehend, but he's also unable to get ahead of Clementine. We can only see the back of her head. What is actually going on with her expressions? The real Joel, when this actually happened for real in Joel's life, he would have been able to catch up with her. He would have been able to deal with and challenge Clementine, confront her, find out what's going on. We don't know, because in this memory, that part has been erased. Yeah, his outlook is corrupted. And we as the audience, Joel as the active participant in his own memories, is unable also to get all the details, which leads to confusion within him. And let's face it, confusion is not exactly the hallmark of a trustworthy narrator.
No, it's kind of the opposite. So he's in a state where we cannot rely on the details of what he says. He cannot rely on the details of what he remembers happening, to the point where he then no longer remembers them happening. Okay, so there's our narrator. What would you say this has to say about the nature of a relationship in a romantic comedy? So in a romantic comedy, we have two characters who, again, we mentioned this before, we have two characters who find a conflict, fall apart, learn to grow, and then having learned their lesson, come back together, and the reward is the bliss of their relationship. This is a story where the two characters do come together in the end. So there is that reward. What have they learned?
Wow, that's a big, long question. Let me try and break it down a little bit. Let's look at what have they learned from each other. By definition, they have completely unlearned everything about each other. They've had their memories erased. Kate Winslet does not recognise Joel when he approaches her in the store, just prior to Joel getting his memory erased. And likewise, after Joel's had his memory erased, he is unable to recognise that it was Clementine who scratched his car, doesn't recognise her, they don't recognise each other when they meet each other on the train. And so there's an interesting interpretation that could be made here. I'm going to debunk it, but there's a suggestion that these two are fated for each other. That it doesn't matter that they've broken up, that they've erased each other from their memories. Their suggestion of them apparently randomly bumping into each other and going through the processes of getting to know each other again, potentially with the idea of a relationship again on the cards, does suggest a certain amount of fate. And if you compare this to some of the worst aspects of a traditional rom-com, there's often a suggestion of fate in some of the less well-written rom-coms. Not all, some of the less well-written, at least in my point of view. So yeah, we have a suggestion of fate. But you also asked about how have they grown? And I would argue, to a degree, certainly Joel was to a degree successful in maintaining an element of Clementine's memory. Just one element. One of the last words, as the final memory is being erased, the earliest memory is being erased, Joel and Clementine have a conversation that clearly did not happen in real life, but is a fabrication of his own invention. And one of the final lines is Clementine saying to Joel, "Let's meet in Montauk." So this is something that Joel has obviously been able to keep somehow. Now, we know nothing about Clementine's memory wiping.
Presumably, she also had a Joel who said, "Meet me in Montauk."
Presumably. So there seems to be this shared notion, this shared idea that transgresses both. Likewise, hundreds, thousands of people, we don't know how many people. Who's to say Joel's story isn't being repeated with everybody who's getting their memory erased? It is at least suggested, not clarified, it is at least suggested with Clementine, because they both have this bizarre random need to go to Montauk, which is where they can meet again, which is where they can start to flourish again. And well, let's look at the part of the question where you said, how have they grown? There's another element to this story. We do get to see the team erasing Joel's memory. And there's a lot going on. There's a lot of character stories that ultimately impact upon Joel and Joel and Clementine's story. She is dating the Elijah Wood character, whose name is Patrick. But we also get to see the Tom Wilkinson as Howard Musiak.
Yeah, I think that's how you'd say it.
I apologise for that poor pronunciation. Who's basically the elder statesman in this operation, the guy who runs everything, who's called in to save the day when Joel's hiding away. But he's there with another team member, Mary, played by Kirsten Dunst, and it's revealed that they had a prior relationship. Mary's memory got erased. She learns about it later on and tries to sabotage Tom Wilkinson's character by raiding the office, getting hold of all the tapes, all the files of all these people who've had their memories erased, and passing them on to those people who've had their memories erased. Here's a huge part of your life that's got taken away from you. I want to give you it back. Because she's clearly hurt. Whether she intends to hurt people or help people, it's unclear. She is hurt. But Joel and Clementine, as they are beginning this relationship, a couple of days later or whatever it is, they get hold of these tapes. Now, initially, they hear Clementine's tape. And Joel is very upset by this. He thinks it's some kind of joke. But later on, they get to hear Joel's tape, and they realise that this is true. They can hear both of them speaking in their own respective tapes, so they know that this has happened. They've had their memories erased of each other. So it's not so much how have they grown, or what have they learned. It's more, we are left with the idea of what opportunities do they have to learn from each other. They know that they've had a failed breakup. They are given elements, biased, one-sided elements from each of their tapes. But rather than push them away, they decide to come back together. Because rather than repeat the mistakes, they now have documented evidence of what their mistakes are. Whether or not they ultimately grow from those mistakes, we don't know. But they are at least given the opportunity to grow. So that is how I will answer your question.
Very succinct.
Is there anything else you would like to say?
Just we can just compare these movies and see what we think of them. But I think I'm good with Eternal Sunshine.
Okay, well, I mean, if we're looking at both movies, and we're looking at alternative rom-coms, I mean, I couldn't find any definition online or in any books. I'm sure somebody's written some thesis or some book somewhere. But the two movies that we've chosen to represent alternative romantic comedies, basically they both have unreliable narrators. That's not to say all alternative rom-coms do, but is certainly the case in at least these two movies.
Yeah, I think anything that subverts the standard romantic comedy could be considered an alternate romantic comedy. And yeah, you do have the unreliable narrator in Annie Hall. Woody Allen's character is absolutely in control of the narrative you hear. So you hear a very one-sided, very curated story. And in Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, you have a character whose memories are literally being deleted as he tells them to you. So yeah, we have very skewed points of view, both from the man in the relationship.
That's correct. As I said earlier, we are at least allowed a glimpse at Kate Winslet externally from Joel, which does not happen in Annie Hall.
Not at all.
But both female characters in Annie Hall and Eternal Sunshine are, again, if anything, too strong for each of these characters. Looking at Eternal Sunshine first, as you said, Joel is a very timid, passive character, whereas Clementine is a very flighty, almost sexually aggressive person. In Annie Hall, again, as you mentioned, Alvy does not grow. Annie Hall does. So again, these are very strong female characters and two passive or undesirable male characters. But ultimately, yeah, it's in both movies, it's effectively the female who moves on, who makes the decision to move on. Annie Hall goes to live her life in LA and get on with her life. Clementine just decides to shut Joel out of his life by, boom, you're not even gone, you're gone from my mind.
So both of these movies are about the things men do regarding the horrible things that the women in their lives do to them.
Yeah, basically. But both of these show a contrast against a traditional romantic comedy.
Very much so.
Because in a traditional romantic comedy, we are only allowed to see the attributes of each character when the writer or director allows us to. So, in Eternal Sunshine and Annie Hall, yeah, we see the two main characters' perceptions, or the two male characters' perceptions of the women. In traditional rom-coms, we are only allowed to see the characters as they are portrayed to us. There's a much more of an objective factor going on in the telling of a story as opposed to in the two movies we chose to talk about, which are much more subjective. And again, both movies have a lot of very interesting flashback techniques and a lot of surreal imagery to show the character's state, either emotionally or what they themselves are allowed to see. Both of them, again, unreliable narrators in that the outside world is allowed to come in and mess around with their minds. There's a scene in Annie Hall, we didn't talk about this earlier, in which the Woody Allen, as his grown-up self, is standing in his childhood home with Annie Hall and some other guy. I never really picked up what connection there.
Just a childhood friend and an
they're both
actor.
calling each other, what was it, Michael? Or Dave or something like
Yeah,
that?
and Max.
Max, that's the one. They're both calling each other Max. And yeah, so they're with this guy, but Woody Allen's talking to his friend and Annie Hall about this is how I grew up. And yeah, Max is able to get inside the memory and play around with it a little bit, alter it. In just the same way that Tom Wilkinson's character, Miyazaki, is obviously taking his memories away. So there's a lot of comparisons between these two movies, and both of these comparisons stand in contrast to what a traditional rom-com is and how a traditional romantic comedy works.
Okay. I think that's fair. I think in both cases it's just subverting the expectation of the audience that these are two characters who will grow and learn to love each other, and that will be the conclusion at the end.
Exactly. Both of these movies, the majority of which takes place during the union of the two characters. Unhappy union, but union nonetheless, whereas in a traditional romantic comedy, the climax, the resolution is the union.
So with 26 years difference, should we be sad that romantic comedies hadn't changed enough, that we really needed a different take on the alternative romantic comedy?
Again, these are not the only two alternative romantic comedies out there. These are just two that we happen to have picked. But, admittedly, trying to do a search of alternative romantic comedies, there's not a lot of movies that come up, but there have been intervening movies. You mentioned When Harry Met Sally earlier, for example.
Yeah, a lot of it too. So this is a genre that doesn't evolve much. You do get a few outstanding cases, like When Harry Met Sally, but it usually regresses towards the mean, and you end up with a dozen more largely forgettable romantic comedies the following year.
In romantic comedies, people want to know what to expect. They don't want to be challenged. And let's face it, if Hollywood can get the money in, it's not going to challenge either. If there's an established format, why be creative? Why think?
I think a lot of Hollywood executives just see this as the female version of the cheap action movie. We'll just have a bunch of explosions and boom. We'll just have some kissing and boom. Money.
That doesn't mean say, even following the established format, there aren't a lot of good romantic comedies out there.
That's true.
I don't watch a lot of them, but I remember when I watched Sleepless in Seattle.
Yeah, it's a good one.
I liked that movie. It was a good movie.
It's a good one. There are good romantic comedies. I don't want to disparage the entire genre out of hand. There are good romantic comedies, and you should watch some good romantic comedies, listener, because these are. There are good movies. There are things that can be said, and there is nothing wrong with feeling good at the end of a movie.
No, absolutely, I agree.
So, Annie Hall, Eternal Sunshine. Anything else to add?
No, I think I've said everything that I want to say.
All right, let's put this one in the can. What do you want to do next week?
Well, just as much as I'm not a huge fan of romance, nor am I a huge fan of sports. Hey, let's look at sports movies.
Okay, so sports movies are, if nothing else, the ultimate American genre.
Again, we're looking at genres. People want to know what to expect.
Okay, here's the thing though. Neither of us are American. So I don't know that it's fair to make us watch and try and grasp an American sports movie. So why don't we take something from each of our cultures? I'll pick a Canadian sports movie. You can pick a British sports movie. and we'll compare those.
Okay, I shall choose Damned United, starring Michael Sheen. And what are you going to choose?
All right, I will take Men with Brooms, starring Paul Gross.
So please take the time to watch these movies. And I don't suggest you get hold of these movies in any illegal ways, but whatever means it takes, please watch these movies and tell us what you think after we finish discussing them next time on Screenalysis. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Good night, everybody.